From the opening tip-off to the final buzzer of the big dance, this is where the madness lives. The roar of the student section, we hear it. The bracket-busting upsets, we predict them. The legends in the making, we've got the stats on lock. Whether you're a die-hard alum or a casual fan of the chaos, you're officially on the clock. This is the pulse of the court. This is the home of the hoop. And this is Hardwood Gameday. And now, the man who lives and breathes the game, here's your host, Trevor Williams.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to another edition of Hardwood Gameday. I am your host, Trevor Williams, bringing you the best action of college hoops before the noon slate gets underway. It's our pregame show. We're giving you the top things, most interesting things going around in college hoops. But before we get underway with that, we want to dive in a little bit more of the MAC conference. We all know how much you know that I love talking about the MAC conference on all of the shows that I've done thus far when it's a solo show. But, ladies and gentlemen, the great breaking news that we all know talking about this entire week, if you've been living underneath the rock, we can now say this, that Sacramento State joins the MAC conference, ladies and gentlemen, only in the terms of football, but we see how this is shaking out. Teams are trying to get themselves relevated and promote themselves going in to expand their conference horizon, to get more marketing, more national attention, going into all that jazz of joining a bigger conference, to get, more scholarships, more TV time, more recognition. But the fees of joining a bigger conference are starting to climb astronomically. Let's just put it into frame of spec to just frame it up. When North Dakota State University of North Dakota, or North Dakota State, when they joined the Mountain West, they had to pay about $12.5 million. Now, let's put that into comparison to Sacramento State, ladies and gentlemen. They had to pay $23 million, if not doubled what North Dakota had to go out and fork over, ladies and gentlemen, on top of that. So just like I said, it just doesn't make sense, the large amount of money that is being forked over to join these conferences. And none of them are always that big on top of that. I just want to make sure that I am saying it right, that North Dakota State joined the Mountain West Conference. But like I said, the entry of what it is going into, I would say, on inside, it's it was about $25 million. Again, the fees and all that stuff. But just to get into the conference itself, it was 12.5. Sacramento had to pay $18 million in entry fees and then a $5 million transaction fee on top of that. So that rounds it out to, $23 million. Now, we teams move around the conference, but this is a bit of a stretch for Sacramento State to join the Mid-Atlantic Conference. Now, if I was Sacramento State, the Mountain West would make the most sense, or, taking the leap and trying to join in the Pac-12. Maybe depending how you want to look at it, two conferences out there, not bad to look at. Maybe even throw yourself in the Sun Belt Conference a little bit, but the Mountain West would make the most sense geographically to support, their campaigns and recruiting and just getting outside, being close to all those conferences just makes sense. Now, you can stretch down into the Big 12 with, what you got going on with the likes of Colorado, but the Mountain West makes the most logical step in progression of getting into the Big 12 or to the Pac-12 that's being rebuilt and rebranded. But joining the Midwest, the Mid-Atlantic Conference, all those schools are all close to each other outside of like UMass and all that stuff. Like they're all close, they're all geographically sound, and they get the TV coverage of Chicago and possibly New York, depending on how you look at it. Now, for Sacramento, you want to be playing in that LA market, and the Pac-12 would make the most sense, or the Mountain West. But you're fighting the Big Ten and trying to get more TV time and all that stuff, which, is in itself not an easy task to pull off. So, like I said, ladies, the Sacramento State is now joining. Now, they even have to play Ball State, and we all know where that's going to go. It's going to be probably one of the best college football rivalries. That's probably not the most appropriate, if you know what I mean. So, you put the two schools together and you see the acronym, and yeah, the most interesting rivalry that we got to date for college football going in. So that's a little bit on the topic of that, ladies and gentlemen. So yeah, that is the greatest news. Will we see other Sacramento State teams join the MAC conference, or will they stay in the conference that they're in? I don't know. We'll see how things shake out with how their football team does before they make any more shifts. But I don't think the school wants to make another conference move until things settle with this campaign they got going on within the MAC conference, ladies and gentlemen. So that is that with that. So let's get the show on the road talking about some beautiful of college basketball. So we're going to start breaking down the women's games for today. But before I go into that, make sure you give us some support and follow us on ETB Network, ladies and gentlemen, so you can catch all the great latest sporting events and all of our shows that we got going each and every week with all of our fantastic hosts, co-hosts, and beautiful people that we have going on this network, just talking and being passionate about their love of sports and the rise of all the action that we got going on in the world of sports. And you can also follow me on my social at TWillie624 for all the latest and greatest of all my content and other ETB content as well, ladies and gentlemen. So let's get the show on the road after doing all the housekeeping items. The women's game. We got a lot of good games going on the women's game, but we want to highlight 3 games that will be talked about, will kind of shape a lot of the women's landscape going into this week of women's college basketball, ladies and gentlemen. So without further ado, let's go into the first game. A little bit lower on the totem pole, but still a good game. Kentucky, number 16 in the nation, versus Vanderbilt, number 5 in the nation. Women's college basketball, Sunday, 3 p.m. Eastern time, noon Pacific time on the SEC Network Plus, ladies and gentlemen. So if you don't have that, make sure you go on, give that a quick little purchase, if you know what I mean. Can't be sponsoring because we don't get ad revenue from the SEC yet, ladies and gentlemen. But maybe one day we'll have that opportunity of having the SEC support us as we do great things, leaps and bounds. But we all know that a lot of us here on this network are Big Ten fans, so we would rather have the Big Ten support us. But any conference is better than no conference supporting us. So conferences, if you're listening, give us some love, give us some little swag, some merchandise, so we can rep it live on air to give your school some free recognition and supporting all those who are passionate about your school and the love that we can get. So give us maybe a banner, some flags, so I can hang it up in the background right over there, ladies and gentlemen, on that empty wall, to have your school right there draped over in my back of my apartment or somewhere else along the walls, if I can get it pointed to it right over there as well. So Kentucky, ladies and gentlemen, a task that they've been struggling all year in the SEC. 7-6, ladies and gentlemen, and Vanderbilt in the SEC, ladies and gentlemen, is a 10-3. Very strong Vanderbilt squad. Very passionate with what these ladies got going on. On top of that, I mean, they got a common opponent in Texas. Vanderbilt beat Texas 86-70, ladies and gentlemen, and they And when Kentucky played, it was 64-53. However, these two squads actually did play each other before on top of that. But when we look at that in the matchup, the score was 84-83. Vanderbilt ends up winning it. I'm going to see if I can try to get that information brought up and to break down what we got going on here today, ladies and gentlemen. So when you look at these two schools and all what is going on between them all, it's one of those things that will play an impact on how Kentucky does in March Madness, ladies and gentlemen. I'm just, like I said, pulling it up to do a deeper dive in all that volume. But Vanderbilt is number 5 in the nation, doing some impressive movement to try to convince people of what they got going on through and foremost. So I'm just trying to find out where they are located. Okay, we got to go to the 3 p.m. slot right there. Oh, no, my bad, ladies and gentlemen. It's the 4 p.m. slot that this game is hosted for tomorrow. Let me make the adjustment because when I had it earlier, that wasn't the case. So let me fix that for the banner real quick. But ladies and gentlemen, yes, Kentucky is 20-7 with their overall record, and Vanderbilt is 24-3. Very, very good performance all the way around between these two schools going at it. But let's dive in to the last time when they played each other to just show you the magnitude of this game, let alone, ladies and gentlemen. So when we look at the field goal percentage of the last time that these two schools played each other, Kentucky shot 56% from the field compared to Vanderbilt's 45%. That's why Kentucky was still in that ball game, ladies and gentlemen, shooting good from the field, over 50%, which kept them in. But however, that's where things start to break down. What happens, ladies and gentlemen? The free throws started to show. If you look at the free throw percentage, Vanderbilt only missed 2 free throws, 13 for 15, which is basically an 87% from the free throw line. However, if you look at Kentucky, ladies and gentlemen, they had 69 from the free throw line. Nice. 69% from the field. Nice. And that puts it to, in grand scheme of things, ladies and gentlemen, 11-16 from the free throw line. So that's what we're looking at here, ladies and gentlemen. Turnovers, Vanderbilt only had 6 turnovers compared to Kentucky's 20 turnovers in that game. But majority of the time, Vanderbilt led this game. 59% of the time was in Vanderbilt's control. And then largest lead change, ladies and gentlemen. Largest lead was by Vanderbilt with 10, but Kentucky also led at one point by 9 points. But if you look at how the game played, in the first half, ladies and gentlemen, of that game, Kentucky was leading. Majority had a better win percentage of turning it around. But then in the second half, in the second quarter, it started to adjust. And Vanderbilt started to rise, improving their chances to win. Then once you got past halftime and going into the third quarter, that is when Kentucky started making a deeper surge. And it just started going in their favor, just grinding it out, playing hard-nosed basketball. But, ladies and gentlemen, once we got into the start going into the fourth, that was when Vanderbilt started to shine. In the fourth quarter, Vanderbilt put up 30 points compared to Kentucky's 25 points in the fourth quarter. And that's kind of what ended up drawing the nail in the coffin in that one, ladies and gentlemen. But from the threes, I mean, shooting 50% from the three is not too bad if you ask me. 10 for 20 from the three-point line compared to Vanderbilt's 11 for 28 when the last time they played each other. So it's definitely one of those things that we have to keep a close eye on how this shakes out. If Vanderbilt has another bad day from the field, ladies and gentlemen, it's going to be one of those games where it gets away from them fast. But again, the free throw line, making the turnovers where they count, being scrappy, getting the steals will kind of help set this game up for success going into this rendition of March Madness, not March Madness, but of this women's basketball game as we get closer and closer to the conference tournament games, ladies and gentlemen. So let's dive into the next game in the slate of things. We want to give love to Michigan State, number 18 in the nation, versus Minnesota, number 23 in the nation. Sunday, 6 p.m. Eastern Time, 3 p.m. Pacific Time on FS1. Ladies and gentlemen, Michigan State has been having some ups and downs throughout this college basketball season. Through it all on the women's side. Losing to Michigan makes it difficult, but they rebounded and came back better than ever against Northwestern, dropping 104 points and only giving up 68 points. However, Minnesota's on a 5-game win streak, beating up the likes of Iowa, Rutgers, Nebraska, Wisconsin, and Ohio State. Looking pretty good on their resume, beating teams relatively convincing. When they played Ohio State, the score was 74-61 in that matchup, ladies and gentlemen. A beautiful matchup, if you ask me, for those Lady Golden Gophers. But when they went into Wisconsin, they won with an even bigger margin with 83-60, ladies and gentlemen. And then you have going into Nebraska, 84-67, ladies and gentlemen. Like I said, the margin of success for Minnesota is huge on how they are trying to rise up in the likes of the Big Ten. Now, if you look at the Big Ten record for both of these two schools, the margin is not too, big as what you want to say. Michigan State's record is 10-6 compared to Minnesota's 12-14. Now, that is good across the board here and there. But if you look at their overall record, ladies and gentlemen, the overall record is 21-6 for both squads. Relatively good. However, Michigan State's women likes to put up some points. They kind of average about 84 points per game, ladies and gentlemen, compared to Minnesota's 76. So as you can see, Minnesota's offense just doesn't click too much. They don't like putting up a lot of points. However, that's where they shine on defense, only giving up about an average of 57 points per game compared to Michigan State's 65. However, when you look at the 65, the numbers on why they adjusted was due to playing Michigan and UCLA, some of the top two women programs as of late right now, going into it all. But it's not an easy task going into what's at stake for this Lady Spartans team. Now, from the field, Michigan State takes this with a nice dub with a 48% from the field compared to Minnesota's 45% from the field, ladies and gentlemen. And then you kind of roll into to rebounds, where they kind of average about the same, where Michigan State averages about, 35 rebounds per game compared to Minnesota's 39. Then the assist margin relatively similar with, 18.4 assists per game compared to 16.5 for Minnesota. Block party, ladies and gentlemen, these two schools don't do a lot of blocking, where Michigan State has about 4 blocks per game on average compared to Minnesota's 2.7, almost 3 blocks per game. However, Michigan State's a little bit more scrappier with about almost 12 steals a game compared to Minnesota's 9 steals per game, ladies and gentlemen. So that is what we're looking at in this game. Definitely going to be an interesting game across the board. Definitely a good Sunday evening game, lining us up for all that good stuff and all that fun jazz on top of that, ladies and gentlemen. But we got to dive in a little bit more in detail for going into the game that we're all going to be talking about in the Big Ten for the women's side of things is Michigan, number 6 in the nation, women's college basketball, with number 13, Iowa. On Sunday, noon Eastern Time, 9 a.m. Pacific Time on Fox, ladies and gentlemen. What a magnificent run that the Lady Wolverines are having. And that is also showing that their men's is the number one team in the nation. So like basically you have two good programs right now. It's the last time we've seen something like this is when UConn does it, when the men are good and the women are both good. It's a good time for when your basketball program's going through that. However, Michigan kind of needs it with all this scandalous actions that are going around their football team. Their basketball team is showing up saying, hey, don't worry about the football team. We're going to show you how to win a national championship, kind of convincingly going through that the right way compared to what their football team end up doing to win theirs. So hopefully there's no scandals for these two, for the programs, for the basketball side of things, but you never know. There's always something scandalous going on in the world of college and things that people don't like and get away with. But we'll see what ends up happening in this matchup. Like I said, ladies and gentlemen, the UCLA matchup is quite interesting where Michigan only lost by 3. However, Iowa kind of got beat down a little bit, 88-65 when they played UCLA. But they didn't really, I mean, they're like their common opponent is kind of like Nebraska on top of that, where Iowa beat Nebraska 80-67, but when Michigan played, it was 88-76. So as you can see, Iowa played a little bit better when they played Nebraska compared to Michigan on top of that. So what was it like? 13, I want to say. Yeah, about 13 points. And compared to, I mean, it's probably relatively similar in some aspects on how we look at it. But keeping an opponent to 60 points in a game is pretty impressive and cracking 80 yourself. But, Michigan almost closed that margin and let them claw back into it. So that is where that resides and what's going on. But when you start breaking it down, ladies and gentlemen, I mean, Michigan has pretty dominant in the field of play. When you look at it overall, Michigan is 22-4 with a Big Ten record of 13-2, with about a 62% chance of winning, compared to Iowa's 21-5 record, compared to a 12-3 Big Ten conference record. Like I said, a pretty dominant performance across the board. I would say you'd be pretty happy with the numbers that you're seeing with how the Lady Wolverines are going up against the Big Ten right now. But if you look at the points per game, I mean, Iowa's barely averaging almost 80 points per game. On average, it's like 79.5. Michigan is about 87 points per game. Points given up, Iowa gives about 66 compared to Michigan's 62. From the field, Iowa shoots slightly better by 1% difference, 49-48. Then rebounds, relatively similar, where Michigan kind of averages about 41 rebounds per game compared to Iowa's 39 rebounds per game. And then you have the assists, ladies and gentlemen. Assists goes to Iowa with 21, and compared to Michigan's 17, almost 18 assists per game. Block parties kind of on average similar, where Michigan averages about 3.7 compared to Iowa's 3.2. And then the steals go to the Lady Wolverines. They're very shifty and crafty, ladies and gentlemen, with a 11.8 steals per game compared to Iowa's 8 steals per game. So when you break this down across the margins of everything, what we got here, I mean, Michigan is probably going to come out with the, wins that they're looking for, the magnitude, the energy that the Lady Wolverines got going on. But that kind of rounds out the action we got on into the slate of women's college basketball. I like where this is going for the women's college basketball front. Let's go into what we'll go into. Women's bracketology. Yes, we're going to start. We're going to talk about the women's bracketology on top of that. So when we're looking at the top overall seed right now is the Lady Huskies of UConn. The last team in is Arizona State, and the first team out, ladies and gentlemen, thus far, if the tournament started today, would be Houston in the overall studies. I mean, you look at it within the region. Let's just kind of break down what the matchups would be if March Madness happened today on the ladies' side of the bracket. So, in the 1 seed in the the Fort Worth area, you have UConn and FDU. As UConn as the 1 seed and FDU as a 16th seed. Then after that, we go to number 8 would be Illinois, and the 9th seed would be Syracuse. What we got going there, like I said, ladies and gentlemen, if the tournament happens to go on today. So keep that in parentheses in your mind. Write it down on a sheet of paper. If the brackets came out today, this is what we're looking at thus far. Then within that region a little bit, you have, Baylor. Then you would have West Virginia, who would be the 5th seed, to Murray State as a 12th seed. Then you have Ole Miss as a 4th seed, and then McNeese as a 13th seed. Then you would have Baylor as a 6th seed, and then Ball State as an 11th seed, Iowa as a 3 seed, and then Western Illinois as a 14 seed as well. Now, kind of rounding that out in the first region in Fort Worth, ladies and gentlemen, you have Notre Dame as a 7th seed, Princeton as a 10, LSU as a 2, and High Point as a 15 seed coming out of the first region. In the second region, ladies and gentlemen, you have in the Sacramento region, you have UCLA as a 1 seed versus UC San Diego as a 16. And then you have another possible 16 most likely as a play-in, CA Baptist as a 16 seed. And then you have Oklahoma State as an 8 seed, Mississippi State as a 9 seed, Minnesota as a 5th seed, and you have Virginia as a possible 12th seed with going up against Arizona State as a possible 12th seed. Then you have Kentucky as a 4th seed, going into Louisiana Tech as a 13th seed. Going in there, you kind of start rounding things out with Tennessee as a 6th seed, with Rice as an 11th seed, TCU as a 3 seed, Idaho as a 14th seed, Washington as a 7th seed, and then Virginia Tech as a 10 seed, Vanderbilt as a 2 seed, and Navy as a 15 seed on the second region, which would be Sacramento. In the fourth region, going into the Sacramento region, you got Texas as a 1 seed, Howard as a 16 seed, NC State as an 8 seed compared to Iowa State, who's a 9th seed. Then you have Oklahoma, who has a 5th seed, compared to Colorado, who's a possible 12, compared to Clemson, that could be a 12. Michigan State as a 4th seed. And then you have Green Bay as a 13 seed, Alabama as a 6 seed, Fairfield as an 11 seed, Duke as a 3 seed, and Charleston as a 14 seed. Interesting matchup that we got going on there. Georgia as a 7 seed, North Dakota State, ladies and gentlemen, as a 10 seed. The Lady Wolverines would be a 2 seed, and they would go up against LMU as a 15th seed. And then you kind of start, round the bend in the Region 3, back to Fort Worth. South Carolina as a 1 seed. Alabama A&M as a possible 16 with a Chattanooga as a 16 seed. Then you go to Oregon versus Villanova. Oregon as an 8th seed. Villanova as a 9th seed. Go into North Carolina as a 5th seed. San Diego State as a 12th seed. Ohio State as a 4th seed versus GA Southern as a 13th seed. Then you have, I would say, Texas Tech, ladies and gentlemen, as a 6th seed, Columbia as an 11th seed. Then you have the 3rd seed of Maryland, and then you have the 14th seed of Vermont. Then USC is a 7 possible seed, with Rhode Island as a 10, Louisville as a 2 seed, and then Eastern Kentucky as a possible 15 seed. Now, the thing that I like about some of the women's games, the earlier rounds, whoever the higher seed gets the home court advantage in the round of 64 and the round of 32. For me, as being an Ohio State fan, since Ohio State is a possible 4 seed, they get to play in Columbus, and I get to go to those games. So in theory, depending how things shake out, I could see Ohio State and North Carolina play each other in a good matchup, a 5 versus 4 matchup. I would be pretty much thrilled if you ask me. Last year, I saw Ohio State, Tennessee play. So that's a thrilling game to watch. I watched in the round of 32, and I got in for that game in the A section behind the basket. I got in for $39 for it. That's probably the cheapest March Madness ticket I will ever purchase in my life. Maybe I could find something lower, but I don't think I'll ever get $39 to get into a women's March Madness game to save my life. I don't think I'll ever find that, ladies and gentlemen. If you find something ever cheaper, let me know for March Madness. A cheaper ticket than $39 to sit in the section A, basically almost down onto the court level, maybe a few rows up. I think I was in like row 11, if I can find that ticket so happenly. Let me see if I can find it, ladies and gentlemen. I'm going to do a quick peek on top of that from expired tickets, if I can find that. There we go. No, that's football. Got a lot of boarding passes there. There we go. No, that's a spring football game. Let's see what we can find here. But like I said, having home court advantages will kind of like change how things will kind of impact things. There we go, ladies and gentlemen. I think I have found it right there. Yes. So when I was there, I was in section 124, row E, seat 26. That's how low I was to the court, ladies and gentlemen. That's how low I was. Row E, ladies and gentlemen, to women's March Madness. And I only paid $39 to sit into that seat, ladies and gentlemen. $39 for one game. I think that, to me, that was a steal of my March Madness experience. But within that bracketology, ladies and gentlemen, I personally like having those home court games. Now, for the men's, obviously, you can't have that luxury as much because, the hotels and, the revenue it comes with of hosting some of these, matchups for different communities. But with women's, the side of things, I mean, I personally like going to these college, early rounds games. It gets you more involved to what's going on. There's going to be other spots where, I could take the trip down to Louisville for an afternoon, depending when the games go in. And I could sit at the University of Louisville and watch the games there. Like, there's things like, even like if I want to make the trek up to Ann Arbor, Michigan, which would be a 3-hour drive, I could watch the number 2 seeded Lady Wolverines, possibly enjoy that game, depending on how it goes. Like, if I'm off that day, I can go in the morning to watch, and then at night, I could just make the trek back down to Columbus to watch it, depending how it is. Like, I'm just like looking around like anything else that would be possibly close. I mean, Nashville is a bit of a stretch to get down there. It's a 5-hour drive. I mean, Lexington, Kentucky could be more doable to get through, but outside of that, everything else is a bit far away for me to get out there to fly. I mean, I could go out to East Lansing, but that's a bit of a tougher drive on top of that. I mean, my 3 games that I could possibly get out of the women's side of the bracket, ladies and gentlemen, is on the lines of Ohio State, Michigan, or Louisville if they survive, on top of how things shake out. Now, we won't know until the actual selection show to get things wrapped around and kind of concluded for the most part. But like I said, we'll see how things develop. And like I said, I am praying that Ohio State women's get a home court of, seed, so I can go out and support the Lady Buckeyes in their March Madness campaign. Again, it's a fun time. Parking wasn't too tricky when I was going there. Yes, parking can be a bit of a challenge sometimes, but the Ohio State does a good job filtering people in and out, as best they can to watch. I mean, worst case scenario, I could just walk to the game and then afterwards just go to one of the campus bars after the game and call it a day. But we'll see how things develop for sure as the women's bracket ends up shaking itself out. But now, ladies and gentlemen, it's now time to start talking about the one, the only, not the one and the only, but the other side of the games that are more, I would say, at stake. The games that are going to probably have a lot of people betting money on is the men's game right now. The men's game has 2 top 5 matchups, ladies and gentlemen. We got a 1 versus a 3 and a 2 versus a 4. It feels like we have a possible Elite 8 competition, or if not a possible Final Four appearance between these two schools. But we won't know until the seeding concludes of what we got going on. Before we start revealing those games, ladies and gentlemen, let's start with the lower side of action. But before we get into that meat and potatoes of the slots for today. So, in the first slot, we gotta get you the appetizer into this 3-course meal. You gotta warm up, but ladies and gentlemen, this where it sits in the time slot, this is more dessert more than anything else than how we look at it. It's one of those games where it's late at night, 10:30 p.m. Eastern time on the East Coast. You are playing, you're most likely, depending what your age group is, you might be at your local bars getting your night underway or rounding out your night, depending on how you want to look at it. But a lot of the younger crowd, this is a prime time to be out and about, 10:30 p.m. Eastern time, 7:30 p.m. Pacific time on ESPN. And you're sitting at your local bar, maybe snacking on a few appetizers to round out your evening, or the kitchen's about to, close or is already closed and you're kind of rounding out your night. Or you pregame relatively well, and now you're at the bars just having a good time. But now, ladies and gentlemen, this is what we're talking about. Iowa, number 6 in the nation, versus BYU, number 23 in the nation. I would be sitting there munching on some onion rings because we're in a food appetite as we start riding up to the noon hour, the high noon hour. And I know you probably all have your favorite snacks in there. But we got some good action for us today. Now, when you look at Iowa State, they have beaten Baylor convincingly, but not too well, 72-69. Nice. And they beat them convincingly. However, when BYU played, they had to score 99 points. The score was 99 to 94. A lot of points being scored in that mix, ladies and gentlemen. So it's one of those things that we have to keep a close eye on to see how it develops and shakes itself out for sure. But, ladies and gentlemen, let's break down the stats. The stats. We all love a good stat line. Points per game, ladies and gentlemen. We're talking about 85, almost 86 points per game for BYU. Very, 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 very strong points. Iowa State, ladies and gentlemen, about 84. Not too shabby. Only 2 points off. But this is where the concern starts to rise, ladies and gentlemen. The concern that we have. BYU gives up about almost 74.5 points per game. Huge points given up compared to Iowa State's about 64.5. That is a huge margin we're talking about, ladies and gentlemen. But from the field, ladies and gentlemen, Iowa State shoots better with a 51% from the field compared to BYU's 48% from the field. So the field might show up and play a factor, but obviously that's on average. So within most nights, you're probably going to assume that Iowa State shoots somewhere, 52 maybe, or to 48, 49 most given nights. And BYU probably shoots around 48% on average, pretty much consistently, maybe a 49% or a 47 within there. But rebounds, ladies and gentlemen, rebounds go to BYU with 39 rebounds per game compared to Iowa State's 36. But then you have BYU's assist game with 14.4 compared to Iowa State's 18.1. Block party goes to BYU with about almost 5 blocks per game compared to Iowa State's 3 blocks per game. And then the steals, ladies and gentlemen, 9 steals a game for BYU. No, 9 steals a game for Iowa State compared to BYU's 7.5 steals per game, ladies and gentlemen. So that's what we're dealing with here on the Big 12 side action. It's late at night. You can't get much more than that, ladies and gentlemen, but we'll see how it unfolds. So you can catch Iowa State, number 6 in the nation, men's college basketball versus BYU, number 23 in the nation, the 21st tonight, 10:30 p.m. Eastern Time, 7:30 p.m. Pacific Time on ESPN. And now we're getting to the first round. Now we're getting to a little bit of the main course. I know this was more dessert from after the fun-filled games that we got going on, but we got to start things off with the appetizer that is pretty decent, if you ask me. Arizona, number 4 in the nation, versus Houston. We have a problem who's number 2 in the nation. Today, 3 p.m. Eastern Time, noon Pacific Time on ABC, ladies and gentlemen. What a game, what a game. A game that will always be talked about from what we got going on. However, ladies and gentlemen, if we're looking at common opponents, BYU is a common opponent that these two schools kind of share against. So when Arizona played BYU, it was 75-68. However, when Houston played, it was 77-66. So that's the margin we're dealing with in this game between these two schools. Now, if you look at the conference record, they're both 11-2 in Big 12 conference play. Pretty solid, if you ask me. And then when you look at the overall record, Arizona 24-2 compared to Houston's 23-3 record. What a matchup. It's a matchup that will have you on your seat. This is like pre-lunch. No, this is post-lunch going into dinner. This is like you are thinking about going to lunch a little bit later. You want to say, or maybe a 2:00 lunch, depending. Or you're thinking about having an early dinner and trying to have, meet with your friends, get some appetizers going before you kind of, start leading your way into, your main course later this evening. But right now, Houston's kind of favored with a 64% chance to win compared to Arizona's 35, almost 36% chance to win. Like I said, there's not much other opponents where it's like, okay, we can try to compare. But like some of the margins that Arizona has, beating Oklahoma State 84-47, it speaks volumes. But losing to Texas Tech in OT and then losing to Kansas, it kind of hurts where they're at. But you got to get some of the losses out of the way before you run into your conference play. But you need to start building on momentum to stay hot. That's the name of the game at this point in February. Got to start building that momentum to build into that consistency on top of that, ladies and gentlemen. So when you take into consideration, you have Arizona with a record of 87.7 points per game. Pretty good, pretty convincing. Compared to Houston's average points per game to 77.8. Now, when you have that, ladies and gentlemen, it's one of those things where you keep a tighter eye around to see how it shakes up, because Arizona gives up a lot more points with a 0.6 points given up per game compared to Houston's almost 62 points given up. From the field, Arizona just shoots better from the field, 51%. However, the last few games, like the last 2 losses that they had, that wasn't the case. They probably had a bad day shooting. That happens to a lot of good teams when they're at this point in the season. But then you have Houston, ladies and gentlemen, who is about 45% from the field. Again, not too shabby, not getting through. but I think it's when you look at how their team stacks up elsewhere. Arizona rebounds better, about 44 rebounds per game compared to Houston's 37. Assists a little bit closer, about almost 18 assists for Arizona compared to Houston's 15. Block party, ladies and gentlemen, goes to Arizona about 4.4, but Houston averages that about 4. So it's like 4.5 to 4. So again, relatively close in that margin. But the steals are about 8 steals a game between the two schools. So it's one of those things where you just keep a close eye to see how things shake out and go from there. Now, personally, this is jockeying for position to sit on top of the Big 12, running the conference, and just figuring out what you need to do to get things through. Like, I am going to show you what the Big 12 is looking like right now in the conference play. And it's between the two schools. They're sitting 1 and 2, followed by Iowa State, Kansas, Texas Tech, West Virginia, and BYU. So what's going to end up happening is Iowa's just going to lurk. They have to win the day to give themselves a better chance to get through. However, you got some tiebreakers here and there that will kind of throw off who gets in over who. However, knocking out BYU kind of puts them, kind of tries to eliminate them from the play of Big 12 tournament a little bit better, but not always. But having Iowa State sitting on the cusp of possibly being the new number 4, depending how it all shakes out. All they have to do is win tonight, and they're good. Arizona needs to win to derail Houston and climb back up to becoming number 1 team in the nation, depending how the game of the week, Michigan versus Duke, plays out after them. So for them, it's like we got to take one game at a time and figure out a way to win that game. That's the bottom line. That's the intensity that they are going through and through for the most part. So we're going to keep a close eye to see how it shakes out at 3 p.m. today, noon Pacific time on ABC. So definitely tune that one in for sure, ladies and gentlemen. And now let's dive into it all. The game of the week. The game that sits at dinner time in the East Coast for some people. Michigan, number 1 in the nation, versus Duke, number 3 in the nation. 6:30 p.m. Eastern time, 3:30 p.m. Pacific time on ESPN. What a game. What a game. What a time to be alive, ladies and gentlemen. What a time to be alive. You have another top 5 matchup. So beautiful. It would make a lot of people shed a tear based on what we got cooking for this matchup here. Michigan making confidence leaps and bounds. Michigan's record thus far, ladies and gentlemen, is 25-1. 25-1, ladies and gentlemen. With Duke being 24-2. I mean, you don't have the common opponents, but Michigan beating up Purdue and winning by 11 points. 91-80. Strong. Destroying UCLA, who's been down this year. 86-56. Taking care of Northwestern, 87-75. Knocking off Ohio State, 82-61. Beating Penn State embarrassingly, 110-69. Nice. But Duke, on the other hand, does the same thing. They embarrassed Syracuse, 101-64. Beating Clemson, 67-54. Beating Pitt 70-54, losing North Carolina in a rivalry game with 71-68, and then Boston College beating that convincingly 67-49. Now, if you look at the stats, I mean, the edge is starting to lead in Duke's favor. However, with the amount of points that they put up and the defense, it's going to be one of those things that you got to capitalize on turnovers and you got to capitalize on the free throw line. That's the best way to shake it down, ladies and gentlemen. I don't think you can overlook the magnitude of this game for the most part. in and out, ladies and gentlemen. It is one of those games that is going to be electric, a perfect primetime action, if you ask me. This is the time where I'm on my second round of wings, or my main course of my burger comes out, or some people who love chicken tenders, they want something quick and light and not too heavy, or they go really into it. I mean, like it's one of those things that this is a main course. This is something that you look forward to. This is probably beer number 2 that you're into right now. A good pint, if you ask me. Definitely something that you got to enjoy at the local sports bar or at your local Applebee's and getting yourself a two for 25, if you ask me. Or, just going to that restaurant that has a TV, or you're sitting at home cooking some barbecue in some warmer states that, are not too chilly. But I mean, like right now in Columbus, Ohio, it's 36 degrees. So I couldn't be outside grilling on the barbecue, getting that charcoal grill out. But the previous part of the week was definitely feeling that for sure. But Michigan averages about almost 91 points per game compared to Duke's 83 points per game. Now, you look at the points against, Michigan gives up about 69 points per game compared to Duke's 63. From the field, ladies and gentlemen, what a margin. 51% from the field for Michigan compared to Duke's 50%. What a game that will be. If they can average that, this game could possibly go into overtime. Rebounds, ladies and gentlemen, with Michigan with a 41.5 compared to Duke's 39.5 rebounds per game. Assists goes to Michigan with 19.5 compared to Duke's 17. Block party goes to Michigan with 6.1 compared to Duke's 3.5. But Duke comes in with the steals with 8.2 compared to 6 steals per game, ladies and gentlemen. It's something that we have to keep a close eye on. That is for sure, ladies and gentlemen. But this is the game that everyone's going to be looking at. Everyone's going to be talking about. Same with Arizona and Houston. So make sure you catch it at 6:30 p.m. Eastern Time, 3:30 p.m. Pacific Time on ESPN. And I have Michigan winning it. Oh, no, well, I guess I disclosed it, but I kind of like Duke to win it more than anything else. I like Duke to win this matchup relatively well, but it's going to be a barn burner from start to finish, and it's all going to be about the game and how the runs are unfolding will dictate the winner of this matchup for sure. Let's kind of look at the men's bracketology, ladies and gentlemen, just to see how things are shaking out. Let me do a quick refresh to see if anything has changed in the bracketology this morning going in. So as an update from yesterday at 8:45 a.m. Eastern Time, Michigan is now still the overall seed. Last team in, ladies and gentlemen, is USC, and the first team is TCU. So in the bracketology, ladies and gentlemen, Michigan as the 1 seed in the Midwest that leads into Chicago goes up against SE Missouri compared to UMBC as a possible 16 seed. Then you have the 8 and 9 seed of 8 as a St. Louis, I should say, as an 8 seed, and then SMU as a 9 seed, Tennessee as a 5 seed, Yale as a 12 seed, Virginia as a 4 seed, and 13 seed as a CBA Baptist. Again, this is the men's. If the bracket happened today, keep that in mind. Number within that, you kind of go into Kentucky as a 6 seed. Then you have Santa Clara as 11 seed, UCLA as 11 seed, Texas Tech as a 3 seed, and UC Irvine as a 14 seed. And then you kind of round things out with Wisconsin as a 7 seed, Georgia as a 10 seed, Iowa State as a 2 seed, and as 15 seed of ETSU as a 15 seed. Going to the east side of the bracket, you in Washington, D.C., you have Duke as a 1 seed versus a 16 seed of BCU versus Howard as a possible 16 seed. Miami, ladies and gentlemen, as an 8 seed versus Texas as a 9 seed. Vanderbilt as a 5th seed. South Florida as a 12th seed. Michigan State as a 4th seed. High Point as a 13th seed. Louisville as a 6th seed with Missouri as a possible 11 seed with USC. as a possible 11 seed, Kansas as a 3 seed, and Austin Perry as a 14 seed, NC State as a 7 seed, UCF as a 10 seed, UConn as a 2 seed versus Navy as a 15 seed. Then we go into the South region, ladies and gentlemen, in Houston, with Houston as a 1 seed, with Wright State as a 16 seed, Clemson as an 8 seed, Indiana as a 9 seed, with Arkansas as a 5th seed, Liberty as a 12 seed, Nebraska as a 4 seed, SF San Austin as a 13 seed, North Carolina as a 6 seed, Ohio State as 11 seed, a 3 seed of Florida, 14th seed of Portland State, Utah State as a 7th seed, A&M as a 10th seed, Illinois as a 2 seed, Troy as a 15 seed, and then rounding things out in the West, ladies and gentlemen, with San Jose in that region, with Arizona as a 1 seed, Long Island as a 16 seed, Iowa as a 8 seed, St. Mary's as a 9 seed, St. John's as a 5th seed, which I do like, but Belmont could be something interesting as a 12 seed, a 4 seed as in Alabama, a 13 seed at UNC Wilmington, number 16 seed for BYU, 11 seed for Miami of Ohio, which could possibly be an upset for BYU. Number 3 Gonzaga versus North Dakota State as a 14 seed. Numbers as a 7 seed as a Villanova, a 10 seed of Auburn, number 2 seed as Purdue. And then you have a 15 seed as Murray Mac as a 15 seed. As you can see, ladies and gentlemen, what a great matchup that we got going here. But if you want to take a look at it, we are watching the 1 seeds battle it out, basically. So in theory, if March Madness goes as planned and all the 1 seeds make it, we are possibly watching a Final Four matchup early at this point before the tournament gets underway. So this is going to be one of those things to see how people will pick in their bracket in that momentum. Obviously, we don't know how things will shake up, but these 2 games will dictate a lot of brackets on how things will unfold for sure between Michigan and Duke and Arizona and Houston. That's what I like going into March Madness. We get some of these key matchups that will kind of dictate on how everything is decided and unfurled. But if you're ever curious about going to March Madness, ladies and gentlemen, make sure you try to secure your tickets depending on how things are. I kind of wait to see how the seating works, to see if ticket prices drop. But if there's a certain team that you want to go out and see, make sure you get them early so you can try to price hedge a little bit. Or if you have possible upsets, the ticket price may decrease for later rounds. So it's a little bit of a gamble action, but you have to wait and see as things unfold. So make sure you watch the ticket prices as things develop for March Madness and everything that goes on for those games. But before I start going into rounding out today's program, thank you so much for tuning in. Looking at the live viewers right now, we're at 47. So one of the bigger turnouts for Hardwood Gameday. So we want to thank you all for tuning in and supporting us to get through this hour show that we have. We start a little bit earlier to get your support so you can get your snacks in and tune in so you can get your beverage to round out your brunch hour, or you start to head into your brunch hour, depending who you are. Some people are running into their lunch hour, but hopefully that you're driving to your local bar or local restaurant to get your lunch in, to feel satisfied, to feel filled with all the possible games going on today, ladies and gentlemen. Like I said, this is Trevor Williams. We're rounding out today's program with 1 minute left. We like to say to thank you and salute you on this glorious day. And as we round out, to ask the last comment before we go in with Cozy Cool, we have some possible sleepers in the men's March Madness for sure. I like Miami of Ohio to be some reckoning. And I did also mention Belmont could be a possible upset for St. John's, but St. John's has a good squad across the board. I mean, just looking at like the early showings, I could see Utah State losing to A&M, a good 7-10 matchup in there, ladies and gentlemen. I'm trying to see what are the possible 13 seeds we got going on. Another possible one would be Auburn-Villanova, but I like Villanova slightly better in that matchup. Georgia-Wisconsin could be an interesting one, but like I said, there's not too many threats in there to cause some, interesting things. Possible upset, there's always that 13 seed upset, and that could be to Michigan State with High Point. But again, it's hard to say, hard to know right now. But as we develop, keep a close eye on the teams that sit in the lower conferences to create some mayhem for sure. But that will do it here for this rendition of Hardwood Game Day. And I will be out next week because I have a trip to do. So we may have a show, we may not. It depends what our show we do on ETB. But I will be out next week. And then when I come back, it depends how I feel because I will be arriving in late to Columbus on March 6th at like 9 o'clock and then trying to do a show, dealing with jet lag being on the West Coast. We might have people support me through that show, or we might not. It depends how I feel going into it. It depends when I get in. Will dictate if I have a show or not. But thank you so much for tuning in, and we'll catch you in 2 weeks for me as a host, but we may have some people filling in for Hardwood Game Day, and we'll take it from here. So long for now. Bye-bye.